My brother lied about paying the mortgage and spent my money on vacations and a gaming PC. When I confronted him, he said, "Wow, you really think so little of me? You've been against me since we were kids." I stayed silent. That was 10 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my house in tears. My greedy brother lied about paying the mortgage and used my money to fund his luxury lifestyle. So I foreclosed the house and gave him a 30 days eviction notice. My brother has been a selfish, manipulative jerk for as long as I can remember. I don't mean just annoying sibling stuff. I mean the kind of person who would watch you fall down, laugh, and then tell everyone you tripped because you were clumsy, even if he was the one who pushed you. When we were kids, he'd eat the last slice of cake my mom specifically saved for me, and then say, "You probably ate it last night and forgot." He once deliberately forgot to feed my pet hamster when I was at camp, and then told me it must have been sick already. In middle school, he convinced my parents that I scratched up my dad's car, even though I wasn't even home at the time, but because he could fake tears and act innocent, they believed him. By the time we were in high school, I'd learned he could never be trusted. He borrowed my laptop to do homework and returned it completely wiped, claiming it just crashed on its own. My external hard drive with 2 years of school projects was gone forever. He shrugged it off and told me I should have backed it up if it was so important. Fast forward a few years, our parents passed away and we inherited the family home equally. I had a job in another city, so we agreed he would live in the house and we'd split the mortgage and expenses. The plan was simple. I would transfer my half of the mortgage to him each month and he'd make the payment. He swore he was good with bills and that I could relax knowing he had it handled. At first, I believed him. Every time I asked for confirmation, he'd wave his phone and say something like, "Paid yesterday," or "Don't worry, I got it covered." He even mocked me for hovering over him about money, saying I had control issues and should learn to trust family. Then I started noticing red flags. The lawn was overgrown, small repairs never got fixed, and the mailbox was stuffed with unopened envelopes from the bank. When I asked, he brushed it off as duplicate statements or junk mail. The truth hit me like a punch in the gut when I got a letter from the bank. The mortgage was 5 months past due, and foreclosure proceedings were about to start. I called him immediately. He sounded irritated, not apologetic. "Relax," he said. "It's just a clerical error. I'll handle it." I demanded proof of payment. That's when the gaslighting started. "Wow, you really think so little of me? You've been against me since we were kids. You always assume the worst." I didn't argue. I went straight to the bank myself. Sure enough, he hadn't paid a cent in months. My half of the mortgage? He'd been using it for vacations, fancy dinners, a new gaming PC, and God knows what else. My money was gone. Here's where karma stepped in. Since the mortgage was in both our names, I had every legal right to deal with the bank. I asked a very specific question. Could I pay off the remaining balance, settle the overdue payments, and have the deed transferred into my name alone? The answer was yes. I drained a big chunk of my savings, paid everything off, and signed the paperwork making me the sole owner. Then I waited for the official documents to arrive before making my move. I drove to the house, walked in, and found him lounging on the couch with his headset on, yelling at a video game. I dropped the envelope on the coffee table. "What's this?" he asked without looking away from the screen. "That's your 30-day notice to vacate." He laughed. "You can't kick me out. It's my house too." "Not anymore," I said. "You stopped paying your share. I bought out the mortgage. It's mine now." He went pale. Then he tried guilt-tripping me. "You're seriously going to make me homeless over a few months of missed payments? You've always been heartless." I told him, "This isn't a few months. You stole from me. You lied to me. You let the bank almost take the house. You're lucky I'm giving you 30 days. He tried threatening to sue. He tried crying. He tried calling relatives to talk some sense into me. But the paperwork was ironclad. He had no leg to stand on. 30 days later, I stood on the porch while he loaded his things into a friend's car. He muttered, "You've always thought you were better than me." I smiled and said, "No, I just think I'm better at paying bills." He's been couch hopping ever since. From what I hear, he's burning bridges faster than he can build them. I don't feel sorry for him. This is the first time in his life he's faced real consequences for treating people like garbage. Every time I sit in my living room, I remember the exact moment I slid that eviction notice across the table and watched his smug confidence evaporate. I thought that was the end of it. Then, last week, I got a certified letter in the mail. It was from his lawyer. My hands shook as I tore open the envelope and pulled out 3 pages of legal papers with complaint for fraudulent transfer and undue influence stamped across the top. The lawyer's name was Miranda Lawson, and she was claiming I'd stolen Derek's rightful home through manipulation during his vulnerable emotional state following parental loss. The letter demanded not only that the house ownership be reversed, but also $50,000 in punitive damages for the severe emotional distress I'd caused. I read it 3 times before the words really sank in. Derek was actually suing me after stealing my money for months. I spent the rest of that afternoon calling property lawyers, but the first 2 said they were too busy, and the third wanted a $10,000 retainer just to look at the case. Finally, I found Veronica Hayes, who specialized in sibling property disputes and could see me that same day. I drove straight to her office with a folder stuffed with every bank statement from the last 5 years, screenshots of Derek's texts promising to pay the mortgage, and all the foreclosure notices from the bank. Veronica spread everything across her conference table and studied each document carefully while I sat there sweating through my shirt. After an hour, she looked up and said this was actually one of the cleaner cases she'd seen, but warned me that lawsuits are expensive and emotionally draining. She agreed to take the case for a $5,000 retainer, which hurt, but was better than losing the house. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started building our defense by screenshotting every single one of Derek's Instagram posts from the last 2 years. There he was in Cancun while the mortgage went unpaid, buying a $3,000 gaming chair the same week I sent him my half of the payment, eating at fancy steakhouses houses and posting about living my best life. I matched each luxury purchase date to my bank transfers and realized he'd been planning this scam from the very beginning. The receipts for his new gaming setup totaled over $8,000, and every single purchase happened within days of my transfers clearing. I was still organizing evidence when I heard pounding on my front door at 11 p.m. Derek was standing on my porch, screaming that I'd stolen his inheritance and that our parents would be disgusted by what I'd done. I grabbed my phone and started recording as he yelled that I was a heartless witch who'd thrown family onto the street for money. He kicked my door so hard the frame cracked and wood splinters flew onto my entryway floor. I stayed silent behind the door while he raged for 20 minutes about how he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. The next morning, I drove to the police station with my phone and filed a report for property damage and harassment. The officer took photos of my damaged door frame and made copies of my recording while explaining that they couldn't arrest Derek without witnessing the incident themselves, but the report would create an official record. I got a case number, and later that day, Veronica called to say filing the report was exactly the right move for our case. 2 days later, another letter arrived from Derek's lawyer with a settlement offer demanding I transfer 50% ownership back to Derek, plus pay him $50,000 for emotional distress or face a lengthy court battle. Veronica actually laughed when she read it and explained they were fishing because if they had a real case, they wouldn't be offering settlements this early. We sent back a formal rejection within 24 hours. A week later, I came out to my car and found thief scratched deep into the driver's side door. I called a locksmith that afternoon who changed every lock in the house and helped me install security cameras on all corners of the property. While he worked, he mentioned he'd seen a lot of family disputes over property, and that money makes people crazy. My best friend Sarah came over that night with 2 bottles of wine and listened while I told her everything that had happened. She reminded me of the time in high school when Derek convinced our parents I'd stolen money from Mom's purse, even though he'd actually spent it on concert tickets. She pointed out that I'd been cleaning up his messes for 20 years, and maybe it was time he faced real consequences. The next week, Veronica filed our response to the lawsuit, including a counterclaim for $47,000 in missed mortgage payments, plus my legal fees. She attached 200 pages of bank records showing Derek received every payment I sent, but never once paid the mortgage with it. She said we needed to put him on the defensive and make him explain where all that money went. 3 days later, my phone started blowing up with notifications because Derek had posted on Facebook calling me a sociopathic sister who threw family out on the street for money. The post went viral in our hometown community group with over 300 shares and hundreds of comments. There's something oddly convenient about how Derek's entire history of manipulation is laid out here, almost like building a case file from day one. I wonder if the narrator really kept track of every single childhood incident, or if memory is filling in some blanks. High school acquaintances I hadn't talked to in years were messaging me, and distant relatives were calling to ask if it was true. Some people who knew Derek's history took my side, but plenty of others bought his sob story about being made homeless by his cruel sister. 2 weeks later, the discovery phase started, and Derek's lawyer sent over a massive document request demanding 5 years of my financial records. The stack of papers landed on my kitchen table with a thud that made my coffee mug jump. They wanted everything from tax returns to credit card statements to prove I could afford the mortgage buyout legitimately. My lawyer Veronica called it standard but invasive. I spent 3 straight days at my dining table surrounded by bankers' boxes and file folders, pulling together pay stubs from jobs I'd forgotten about and bank statements that showed every coffee purchase and grocery run. My fingers turned black from old printer ink and paper cuts covered my hands. Each document felt like handing over pieces of my private life to be picked apart by strangers. While I was drowning in paperwork, my phone rang with an unknown number. Tom Bradley introduced himself as Derek's current roommate and said Derek hadn't paid a cent toward rent since moving in 3 months ago. Tom sounded tired and frustrated as he explained Derek kept promising money after the lawsuit settled. He was planning to kick Derek out next week and thought I should know what I was dealing with before hanging up quickly. The court scheduled our first hearing for 3 months out, which Veronica called lightning fast for civil court. She warned me Derek's lawyer would use every delay tactic in the book to drag this out and wear me down. The legal system moved like molasses in winter, and we'd probably have several preliminary hearings before any actual trial. One afternoon, I drove past our old childhood home on Maple Street without really planning to. The new owners had painted it bright yellow, which Mom would have absolutely hated since she always said yellow houses looked like giant bananas. Standing there looking at that ugly paint job, I remembered how Mom always made excuses for Derek's behavior, and Dad just went along with whatever she said. They never made him face real consequences for anything, and maybe that's why we ended up here. Derek's deposition request arrived the next week, and reading it made my stomach turn. His lawyer wanted to question me about our parents' deaths and whether I manipulated them in their final days. They died in a car accident 5 years ago when a drunk driver ran a red light, and Derek knew bringing them up would destroy me. Veronica put her hand on my shoulder and promised this was just a tactic to make me settle out of court. Things got worse when my boss pulled me into his office and asked if everything was okay. Derek had been calling HR claiming I was involved in criminal fraud and suggesting they should investigate my expense reports from the last 3 years. My face burned with embarrassment as I had to explain the family lawsuit to my boss, who thankfully said he'd handle HR but looked concerned. A month later, Angela Ross from the bank agreed to provide an affidavit about Derek's payment history. She remembered me crying in her office when I discovered the foreclosure notice and wrote that in 20 years of banking she'd rarely seen such clear financial abandonment. Her statement detailed detailed every missed payment and every excuse Derek had given the bank. Then Derek's lawyer subpoenaed our Uncle Robert, hoping he'd testify about family dynamics. Robert called me immediately, furious about being dragged into this mess. He told me Derek had pulled the same thing with him 10 years ago, borrowing $5,000 for a business venture that never existed. Robert said he'd testify, but for me, not for Derek, and that he had receipts to prove Derek's pattern of theft. While searching for old bank documents in my closet, I found a shoebox full of childhood photos. One picture stopped me cold, showing Derek and me at Christmas when we were maybe 7 and 9. He's literally pulling a toy robot from my hands while I'm crying, and even in that old photo, you can see his smirk. Some patterns really do start early and never change. Derek's deposition happened 2 weeks later in a sterile conference room downtown. He sat there in a borrowed suit, claiming I pressured him to take my money instead of paying the mortgage directly. He said I insisted on this arrangement specifically to steal the house later. When his own lawyer showed him screenshots of his texts saying, "I got the mortgage covered, stop worrying," Derek claimed I made him send those messages. Even his lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair and started shuffling papers to avoid eye contact. 2 weeks after that disaster of a deposition, the judge's office sent us both certified letters ordering mediation before trial. Standard procedure, they said, to encourage settlement and reduce court backlog. Veronica sat across from me in her office, flipping through the court order while I watched pigeons fight over breadcrumbs on the windowsill outside. She tapped her pen against the desk and told me mediation meant compromise. But sometimes the best strategy was showing you won't compromise when you're completely in the right. The mediation got scheduled for next month at the courthouse downtown. I left her office and stopped at the grocery store to grab dinner stuff when I literally ran my cart into someone near the frozen foods. It was Tom, Derek's friend who'd been letting him crash at his place. He looked tired and apologized right away. Not for the cart thing, but for everything with Derek. Tom shifted his weight and told me Derek got evicted from his apartment after bringing random people over for parties and damaging the walls. He said Derek kept telling everyone he'd be rich after the lawsuit, and Tom thought Derek actually believed his own lies now. I grabbed a frozen pizza and got out of there fast. 3 days later, Veronica called me into her office again with a stack of papers that made my stomach drop. Derek's financial records had come through Discovery, and they painted an ugly picture. Page after page showed cash advances from credit cards, charges at gambling websites, luxury car rentals, expensive restaurant bills, but no steady income for 2 years straight. One credit card statement had a $3,000 charge at a Vegas casino the same week Derek claimed he was too broke to help with utilities. Veronica photocopied everything and put it in a folder marked evidence while I sat there feeling sick. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept replaying every moment I'd enabled Derek by not calling out his lies earlier. The ceiling fan wobbled as I stared at it, thinking about all the times I'd made excuses for him. My new therapist had pointed out during our session that I was trained from childhood to accept Derek's behavior as normal. She said I wasn't responsible for his choices, only for protecting myself now, but those words didn't help at 3 in the morning. I finally dozed off around 5 and woke up late for work. The parking lot at my office was mostly empty when I pulled in around 10 that morning. I noticed Derek's beat-up Honda in the visitor section, but figured maybe it just looked similar. When I got out of my car, I saw him standing by my driver's side door with something in his hand. Security cameras were recording everything as he dragged his key along the paint, leaving a deep scratch from the mirror to the tail light. He stuck a note under my windshield wiper that said, "You'll lose everything like I did," in his messy handwriting. I backed away slowly and called 911 from inside the building while watching him through the lobby windows. 2 police cars showed up within minutes and arrested him right there in the parking lot. He spent the night in jail before Tom reluctantly bailed him out the next morning, according to the police report. 3 weeks passed before the mediation date arrived, and Derek showed up 20 minutes late wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. He refused to look at me and sat slouched in his chair while his lawyer presented their demands. They wanted full ownership of the house plus $100,000 in damages for emotional distress and lost income. The mediator actually sighed out loud and rubbed her temples. When Veronica and I refused their ridiculous offer, Derek stood up so fast his chair fell over. He yelled that he'd destroy me in court before storming out and slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Veronica didn't waste any time after that mess and filed a motion to fast-track the trial due to Derek's pattern of harassment and escalating behavior. She attached the police reports, documentation of the violated restraining order, and signed statements from witnesses who saw him key my car. The judge reviewed everything and granted our request, moving the trial date from 6 months out to just 6 weeks away. Sarah came over to help me prepare for trial testimony since she'd been through a nasty divorce herself. We sat at my kitchen table going through potential questions while she played the role of Derek's lawyer attacking my character. She kept reminding me that I had the facts on my side while Derek only had manipulation tactics. We practiced for hours until I could answer hostile questions without my voice shaking or getting emotional. Later that week, I sat down and wrote a letter to my dead parents that I'd never send. I told them how their golden child turned out and explained how their refusal to hold Derek accountable led directly to this moment. My therapist said it was healthy to acknowledge my anger at them too, not just at Derek, and writing helped get it out of my system. 2 weeks before trial, Uncle Robert gave his deposition at Veronica's office downtown. Derek's financial records read like a how-to guide for terrible life choices, casino charges while claiming poverty, his peak little brother energy. The car keying incident really takes the cake though. Nothing says, "I deserve your house," quite like committing crimes in front of security cameras. He brought a banker's box full of evidence showing Derek's pattern of financial exploitation one, going back 15 years. There were copies of bounced checks Derek had written him, broken loan agreements with Derek's signature, and printed text messages where Derek threatened to ruin him if he didn't keep lending money. Veronica looked through everything with wide eyes and called it a gift to our case. The next morning, Derek's lawyer filed a motion claiming I was mentally unstable and making up evidence about the mortgage payments. He wanted my therapy records from when our parents died, saying it would prove I couldn't tell reality from fantasy. Veronica shut that down fast with her own motion, telling the judge that my mental health had nothing to do with whether Derek stole my money. The judge agreed and threw out their request in less than 5 minutes. 3 days later, we got the witness list for trial, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. Derek had gotten 2 of our old friends from high school to testify that I'd always been jealous of him and wanted everything he had. These were people who used to come to our house for dinner, who knew our family, and now they were going to lie for him in court. Veronica saw me getting upset and reminded me that character witnesses didn't matter when we had bank records showing exactly where my money went. I drove to the house that afternoon and walked through every room, looking at all the work I'd done since taking ownership. The new water heater in the basement that Derek had let rust out. The roof I'd fixed after years of his ignoring the leaks. Fresh paint on walls that had water stains from those same leaks. The new furnace he'd never serviced. The updated electrical panel he'd let spark and smoke. This house was more mine through all that work than it ever was his, just because our parents left it to both of us. That night, I saw Derek's latest Facebook post claiming I was mentally and emotionally abusing him through the legal system. He wrote paragraphs about how I was using lawyers to destroy his life over a simple misunderstanding. But this time, the comments weren't supporting him. Someone had posted screenshots of his Vegas trip from 6 months ago when he was supposedly too broke to pay bills. Pictures of him at expensive restaurants, bottle service at clubs, fancy hotel rooms. People were calling him out, asking how he afforded all that if he was so poor. The post disappeared within an hour, but screenshots were already spreading. 1 week before trial, I couldn't eat anything. My stomach was in knots and even water made me feel sick. Sarah came over with takeout I couldn't touch and stayed the night to help me get ready. She organized all my documents into labeled folders, picked out my court outfit, and made sure I had everything printed in triplicate. She kept saying Derek would finally face consequences, but I couldn't believe it. He'd slipped out of trouble our whole lives, always finding someone else to blame or some excuse that worked. Trial day 1 arrived, and I sat in the courtroom watching Derek's lawyer stand up for opening statements. He painted me as a cold, calculating sibling who took advantage of Derek's depression and confusion after our parents died. He claimed I manipulated a grieving brother out of his childhood home over a few late payments. He actually used the word predatory. Then Veronica stood up and calmly laid out the facts. Derek took $47,000 from me over 8 months. He never made a single mortgage payment. He spent my money on luxury vacations and expensive toys while the house went into foreclosure. She had receipts for everything. When I took the stand, Derek's lawyer came at me hard, demanding to know why I didn't just pay the mortgage directly if I cared so much about the house. I stayed calm and showed him the texts where Derek insisted he had it handled, where he told me to stop treating him like a child, where he promised everything was fine. The lawyer asked why I never verified the payments, and I told him I never imagined my own brother would steal from me while letting our parents' house go into foreclosure. Angela from the bank testified next, and she was perfect. 20 years working in mortgage services, and she'd never seen anything like this. She showed records proving Derek never made a single payment, despite getting my transfers every month. She had documentation showing the foreclosure was days away when I stepped in to save the house. Derek's lawyer tried to confuse her with technical questions, but she knew her job inside and out. During cross-examination, Derek's lawyer suggested I was lying about how much money I gave Derek. Veronica pulled out our evidence, bank transfer after bank transfer, with memo lines reading mortgage payment, each one matching Derek's deposits exactly. The judge actually raised an eyebrow when he saw how clear the paper trail was. Every transfer from my account matched a deposit to Derek's account within 24 hours. Day 2 of trial came, and during the lunch break, I was refilling my water bottle in the hallway when Derek appeared beside me. His lawyer was practically running toward us, but Derek leaned in close before he could reach us. He hissed that Mom would have wanted him to have the house because he was the son, the real heir, not some daughter who abandoned the family for a job. Security stepped between us before I could say anything, but at least 5 people heard him, including a court reporter who was getting coffee nearby. His lawyer grabbed Derek's arm and yanked him toward the courtroom doors, while the judge was already taking his seat for the afternoon session. 20 minutes later, Derek was on the witness stand, his hands folded like he was praying, telling the court how he'd used every penny of my money for household expenses. He claimed the roof leaked, the furnace broke, the plumbing needed fixing, all while I was living in another city. Veronica stood up with a thick folder and started pulling out papers one by one. First came the credit card statement showing $3,000 at the casino, the same week I'd sent him mortgage money. Then photos from his Instagram showing him in Vegas with bottle service at a nightclub 2 days after my transfer cleared. Derek's face went red, and he stammered that those were old photos he'd just posted late. The judge raised an eyebrow when Derek insisted the casino charges were business meetings with potential investors. Veronica pulled out more receipts like she was dealing cards at a poker table. The gaming computer receipt dated 2 days after my October transfer, the price tag matching my mortgage payment exactly. The receipt for a leather jacket from some designer store I'd never heard of, bought the same afternoon he texted me about being too broke to buy groceries. Vegas hotel confirmation for a suite at the Bellagio, booked literally the day my money hit his account. Derek kept sweating through his shirt, dark patches spreading under his arms arms as he tried to explain each receipt away. The computer was for work, the jacket was on sale, the Vegas trip was for a job interview that fell through. Veronica showed the court his text messages to me from those exact dates, each one claiming he was broke, desperate, barely surviving. The judge was writing notes so fast his pen was scratching across the paper like he was trying to carve the words into his desk. Derek finally gave up trying to explain and just sat there looking at his hands while Veronica stacked the evidence into neat piles on her table. Uncle Robert took the stand next, looking older than I remembered, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the microphone. He told the court about the restaurant Derek had convinced him to invest in 5 years ago, complete with fake business plans and forged permits. $20,000 disappeared into Derek's accounts, while Uncle Robert thought he was funding his nephew's dream. When Robert figured out the scam and confronted him, Derek threatened to tell Robert's wife about an affair from 15 years ago if he went to the police. The judge stopped writing and stared at Derek, who was slumped so low in his chair he looked like he was trying to melt into the floor. Robert's voice cracked when he described how Derek had smiled while making the threat, like destroying family was just another Tuesday for him. 2 other relatives testified by video call about similar scams, loans that were never repaid, investments that never existed, always with threats or emotional manipulation to keep them quiet. By 5 o'clock, my head was pounding and my shirt was soaked with sweat, even though the courtroom was freezing. The judge called it a day and said closing arguments would be tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. I walked to my car in the parking lot and sat there for 20 minutes, too tired to even start the engine. Veronica had texted that she was confident that the evidence was overwhelming, but I'd watched Derek wiggle out of consequences my whole life. The house key felt heavy in my pocket as I drove home, wondering if it would still be mine in 2 weeks. The next morning, Derek's lawyer stood up and started her closing argument like she was giving a eulogy at a funeral. Poor Derek had been grieving our parents, struggling with depression, barely able to function, and I'd swooped in like a vulture to steal his childhood home. She actually used the word vulture while looking right at me, suggesting I'd planned this whole thing from the day our parents died. She painted Derek as a lost soul who made some mistakes with money while drowning in grief, and me as the cold sister who abandoned the family for a career. My stomach churned as she twisted every fact, making Derek's theft sound like confusion, his lies sound like miscommunication, his threats sound like cries for help. She even suggested that I'd pressured him into the mortgage arrangement, knowing he couldn't handle money, setting him up to fail so I could take the house. Robert's testimony about that restaurant scam from 5 years ago makes me wonder how many other family members Derek has burned through over the years. The judge's pen scratching away like he's carving those words into wood suggests he's seeing the pattern too. When she finally sat down, I thought I might throw up right there in the courtroom. Veronica stood up and walked to the center of the room, carrying a single piece of paper. She read from it like she was reading a grocery list, completely calm and matter of fact. Derek received money, didn't pay the mortgage, bought luxury items, the house nearly went into foreclosure. I saved it with my own money, gave him proper notice. She held up each receipt as she mentioned it, creating a timeline on the board that showed Derek's spending spree lined up perfectly with my transfers. This isn't complicated, she said, turning to look at the judge. The defendant took money meant for mortgage payments and spent it on himself while lying about it. She pointed at the evidence table covered in receipts, bank statements, text messages, and printed emails. He committed fraud, and now he wants to be rewarded for stealing from his sister by getting the house he almost lost. The judge nodded and said he'd issue a written decision within 2 weeks, which was standard for civil cases in our county. He looked directly at Derek and then at me, warning that any harassment or contact outside legal channels would result in criminal charges. Derek's lawyer practically had to drag him out of the courtroom while he kept turning back to glare at me with pure hatred in his eyes. Sarah met me at a bar downtown and ordered us both doubles before I even sat down. She kept saying I did it, that it was over, that I'd won, but the words bounced off me like rain on glass. 20 years of Derek getting away with everything had trained me not to trust victories that came too easy. We drank until the room got fuzzy, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that Derek would find some way to turn this around. 3 days later, I went back to work, trying to pretend everything was normal, while my phone sat face up on my desk. Every email notification made my heart skip, thinking it might be Veronica, with news about the ruling. My coworkers who knew about the trial kept stopping by with coffee and supportive comments, but I could barely focus on my computer screen. The spreadsheets blurred together while my mind replayed every moment of the trial, looking for something we'd missed, some trick Derek might pull. Tom texted me that afternoon with a screenshot of Derek's Facebook post, asking if anyone knew a good appeal lawyer who worked on contingency. Another text said Derek had been calling everyone in our extended family trying to borrow money, absolutely certain he was going to win on appeal. Tom wrote that Derek kept telling people the judge was biased, that I'd paid off witnesses, that the whole trial was rigged against him. The delusion was so complete that he'd already told people he was getting the house back, plus damages for emotional distress. The worst part was the nightmares that started right after Tom's texts. Every night I'd wake up sweating, dreaming Derek had somehow gotten back into the house, destroying everything I'd worked to rebuild. My hands would shake as I checked all the locks, walking through each room to make sure nothing had been touched. The therapist I started seeing said these were normal trauma responses after years of Derek's lies and manipulation. She explained that my body was stuck in survival mode, always expecting the next betrayal, because that's all it had known with him. A week after the trial ended, my phone started blowing up with messages from cousins and aunts I hadn't heard from in months. Derek had posted a 40-minute video rant on Facebook, calling me every name in the book while waving court documents at the camera. He showed our parents' old photos, told made-up stories about our childhood, and claimed I'd bribed the judge with money I'd supposedly stolen from him. The video went viral in our hometown within hours, getting shared hundreds of times with people taking sides in the comments. Veronica called me immediately after watching it, her voice tight with anger as she started drafting emergency motions. She filed for contempt of court that same afternoon, along with a defamation suit for the lies Derek was spreading publicly. The judge issued an emergency order within 24 hours, demanding Derek remove all social media posts about the case immediately. The court order also banned him from making any public comments about the lawsuit or me while the case was still active. That's when Derek's lawyer filed her own motion, asking to withdraw from representing him due to what she called irreconcilable differences with her client. The judge granted it without hesitation, leaving Derek to either find new representation or represent himself in court. My phone rang 2 days later with an unknown number, and a reporter's voice asked if I wanted to comment on my brother's viral accusations. I wanted so badly to tell my side, to explain the years of theft and lies, but Veronica had warned me to stay silent. She said anything I said could be twisted and used against us, that Derek was trying to bait me into a public fight. I spent the next week cleaning out the basement to keep myself busy, trying not to think about the lies spreading online. That's when I found a cardboard box shoved behind the water heater, full of Derek's old mail he'd hidden away. Inside were dozens of past due notices, court summons for unpaid credit cards, and angry letters from people demanding their money back. One letter from a former business partner accused Derek of stealing $40,000 from their joint account. Another was from an ex-girlfriend threatening to sue him for the 10 grand he'd borrowed and never returned. I photographed every single document, creating a folder of evidence showing Derek's pattern of financial destruction went back years. The waiting period after the trial was torture, with each day feeling like a month as I waited for the judge's decision. I threw myself into repainting Derek's old room, covering the walls with fresh white paint to erase every trace of him. Sarah came over with paint samples and furniture catalogs, insisting we turn it into the home office I'd always wanted. We picked out a desk and bookshelves, acting like the victory was certain, even though my stomach churned with worry every night. 2 weeks after the trial, I was assembling the new desk when my phone rang with Veronica's number. Her voice was bright when she said the 2 words I'd been praying to hear. The judge had ruled completely in our favor, ordering Derek to pay back the stolen $47,000 plus all my legal fees. The total came to nearly $70,000, an amount that made my head spin when Veronica read it out loud. The judge's written ruling arrived the next day, and it was even more brutal than I'd expected. He called Derek's testimony wholly incredible, and noted the overwhelming evidence of fraudulent behavior throughout the case. The ruling stated that Derek's claim to the house was entirely without merit, and awarded me additional damages for emotional distress. Every page contained phrases like deliberate deception and pattern of manipulation that validated everything I'd been saying for months. Derek immediately tried to file an appeal, but without a lawyer, his paperwork was full of basic procedural errors. The appellate court rejected it within 3 days, sending it back with a notice about improper filing procedures. He had 30 days to refile correctly, but everyone knew his chances without legal representation were basically zero. A week later, Derek's former friend Mark called me out of the blue, his voice shaking as he described what had been happening. He said Derek had been living in his car for weeks, showing up at people's houses at all hours demanding money for his appeal. Mark told me Derek was completely convinced that I'd paid off the judge and that the whole system was rigged against him. That night, I actually slept for 8 hours straight without waking up once. The next morning, I walked through every single room of my house, touching the walls and door frames. The kitchen where Mom taught me to make her famous lasagna was mine now. The living room where Dad watched football every Sunday belonged to me. I stood in Derek's old bedroom and felt nothing but relief that he'd never sleep there again. 3 days later, a certified letter showed up requiring Derek to pay the full judgment amount within 30 days. The letter spelled out what would happen if he didn't pay, which we all knew he couldn't. They'd garnish any wages he might earn and seize any assets he might own. Of course, Derek had no job and no assets to take. The victory felt empty, knowing I'd never see a penny of that money back. A week after that, Derek filed his own appeal without a lawyer. The court clerk later told me his filing was 15 pages of crazy rambling about corruption and family betrayal. He claimed I'd bribed the judge and that the whole legal system was rigged against him. The appellate court took one look at his mess of a filing and dismissed it with prejudice. That meant he couldn't file another appeal ever again. His legal options were completely dead. 2 weeks passed before Derek completely lost it. He showed up at Uncle Robert's house at 2 in the morning, pounding on the door and screaming. Robert called me the next day and told me Derek had demanded money for being abused by the family. He kept yelling that everyone owed him for years of mistreatment. Robert had already filed a no-contact order after Derek's previous harassment. When the cops showed up, Derek was still on the porch screaming about family betrayal. They arrested him for trespassing and violating the protection order. This time, nobody bailed him out. Derek sat in jail for a whole week before his hearing. The judge looked at his record of harassing multiple family members and wasn't impressed. She sentenced him to 90 days with required anger management classes after release. Derek's video rant waving court documents at the camera is peak person who definitely lost their case behavior. Nothing says innocent like a 40-minute Facebook meltdown, calling your sister names while your own lawyer literally runs away from representing you. At 40 years old, Derek was finally facing real consequences for his actions. While he was locked up, I drove to the cemetery where Mom and Dad were buried. I hadn't been there since the trial started. I sat on the grass between their headstones and told them everything, how their golden golden boy had become a criminal who stole from family, how I'd saved their house from foreclosure. Part of me wondered if they'd be proud or horrified by what happened. Then I realized I didn't need their approval anymore. With Derek in jail, the house felt different. No angry texts waking me up at night, no surprise visits with him pounding on my door, no nasty posts about me on social media. I started having friends over for dinner again, something I hadn't done in months. My friend Sarah said I looked 10 years younger without all that stress. About a month into Derek's jail sentence, Tom called me out of nowhere. He said he needed to apologize for believing Derek's lies about me. He admitted Derek had completely fooled him with his victim act. He's a master at making himself the victim, Tom said. I should have seen it sooner. Tom told me Derek had borrowed money from him too and never paid it back. The whole family was finally seeing who Derek really was. I decided to start seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma. She helped me understand how our parents created this whole mess. Derek was the golden child who could never do wrong. I was the responsible one who had to fix everything. She explained that breaking this pattern meant accepting I couldn't save Derek from himself. He had to want to change, and clearly he didn't. Meanwhile, Veronica filed liens against any future assets Derek might get. If he ever inherited money, won the lottery, or got any kind of legal settlement, I'd get paid first. We both knew Derek would probably never have anything worth taking, but the lien would follow him forever as a reminder of what he owed me. A week before Derek's release date, I got another letter from him at the jail. The envelope had that same angry handwriting, all sharp angles and pressed down lines that tore through the paper in places. I opened it expecting maybe an apology, or at least some sign he understood what he'd done. Instead, 3 pages of pure rage stared back at me. He wrote that I'd destroyed his life, stolen everything from him, turned everyone against him. The words got darker as they went on, promising he'd never stop fighting for what was rightfully his, that I'd pay for ruining him. I drove straight to Veronica's office and handed her the letter. She read it twice, took photos of every page, and filed them as evidence for a permanent restraining order. The hearing happened 2 days later in a small courtroom downtown. The judge reviewed Derek's arrest record, the fraud charges, the harassment, and now these threats from jail. She granted the order without hesitation. Derek couldn't come within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace for the next 5 years. She specifically noted his escalating pattern of harassment and complete refusal to accept legal rulings. The bailiff handed me the official paperwork, and I felt my shoulders drop with relief. That afternoon, I called a security company and scheduled an installation for the next day. The technician showed up with boxes of cameras, motion sensors, and new locks for every door. He worked for 6 hours, drilling holes and running wires through the walls. When he saw me watching nervously, he mentioned they see this all the time with family disputes. Blood doesn't mean safety, he said while mounting a camera above the front door. I had him add extra sensors to the windows and a panic button by my bed. Sarah came over that weekend to help me clear out Derek's old room. We pulled everything out of the closets, stripped the walls bare, and started fresh with primer. Behind a loose baseboard, we found a small plastic bag with what looked like old drug stuff, pipes, and little baggies with residue. I wasn't even surprised anymore, just sad thinking about all the secrets he'd kept. We painted the walls a soft gray and turned it into a guest room with new furniture from a discount store. On Derek's release day, I stayed home with all the doors locked and the security system armed. Around noon, my phone started buzzing with emails from an address I didn't recognize. The subject lines were all variations of "You know what you did" and "Karma is coming." I opened one and found pages of rambling text about justice and revenge and how I'd stolen his life. The writing style was pure Derek, same angry energy as his letters. I forwarded everything to the police, and they issued a warrant for his arrest for violating the restraining order. For 2 weeks, Derek managed to stay hidden, bouncing between different people's couches. I heard through mutual contacts that he'd show up at someone's door with a sob story, crash for a few days, then get kicked out when they found out about the warrant. His circle of enablers was finally shrinking as people learned the truth about what he'd done. Then a private investigator showed up at my door, asking questions about our parents' deaths and suggesting I had motive to steal the inheritance. The guy was sketchy, wouldn't show proper ID, kept pushing to come inside. I called Veronica immediately, and she sent him a cease and desist letter threatening harassment charges. He never came back, but it left me rattled. I found myself constantly checking locks, looking over my shoulder in parking lots, screening every call before answering. My therapist said it was hypervigilance, a normal response to prolonged threat, and promised it would fade with time and continued safety. 3 weeks later, Derek got arrested at a casino after causing a scene and refusing to leave when security asked. When they ran his ID, the warrant popped up immediately. They brought him back to face charges for violating the restraining order. The prosecutor, who dealt with Derek before, recommended 6 months in jail this time. At his sentencing, Derek decided to represent himself again, standing up in his orange jumpsuit to claim I'd orchestrated everything to steal his life. The judge listened for about 5 minutes before cutting him off. She pulled up his criminal history on her computer screen, all the charges that had piled up in just a few months. She sentenced him to 8 months with mandatory psychological evaluation. Derek started screaming that it was all a conspiracy, that the whole system was rigged against him. The bailiffs had to physically drag him out of the courtroom while he kept yelling about corruption and stolen inheritance. I drove home from the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. The next few weeks passed quietly while Derek sat in jail waiting to be transferred to prison. I finally felt safe enough to call contractors about the house renovations I'd been putting off. The kitchen cabinets were falling apart, and the bathroom still had that awful pink tile from the 70s. I picked out new white cabinets and gray subway tile for the backsplash. The contractor Contractors started work the following Monday, and I watched them tear out all the old stuff Derek had let rot. Each improvement made the house feel more like mine, and less like the war zone it had become. The neighbors started noticing the changes, too. Mrs. Henderson from next door stopped by to say how nice the new landscaping looked. I'd planted rose bushes along the front walkway and put in fresh mulch around the trees. About a month into the renovations, Uncle Robert called me out of the blue. He said he'd been hearing things from other family members about Derek's arrest and wanted to know the real story. I told him everything from the mortgage fraud to the fake assault charges. Uncle went quiet for a long moment, then said he wasn't surprised. Turns out my cousins had been sharing their own Derek stories at a recent family dinner. Cousin Sarah mentioned the $500 Derek borrowed for a car repair that never happened. Cousin Mike talked about how Derek had told him I was stealing from our parents' estate to turn the family against me. Uncle said everyone was finally seeing the pattern they'd ignored for years. The family scapegoat was never me. It was always Derek creating drama and playing victim. 2 months later, I decided to host Thanksgiving for the first time since our parents died. Uncle came along with Sarah, Mike, and their families. We set up the dining room table with Mom's old china and Dad's carved turkey platter. Nobody mentioned Derek once during the entire meal. It was the most peaceful family gathering we'd had in years. The kids played in the backyard while the adults sat around drinking coffee and sharing normal stories about work and vacations. A week after Thanksgiving, I got a letter from the prison with Derek's inmate number on it. My hands shook a little as I opened it. The letter was different from his usual angry rants. This time he claimed he'd found clarity through the prison counseling program and wanted to make amends for everything he'd done. He wrote about taking responsibility and understanding the pain he'd caused. Every word dripped with manipulation. I recognized the same tactics he'd used our whole lives, just wrapped in therapy language now. I drove straight to Veronica's office and handed her the letter to file with the restraining order violations. She added it to the growing folder of evidence. Around Christmas, Sarah called to warn me that Derek had been calling family members from prison. He was telling everyone he'd reformed and just needed commissary money to buy basic supplies. Most of the family refused after everything that had come out, but Aunt Linda and a few others still sent small amounts. Sarah said he called her 3 times in 1 week with different sob stories each time. The pattern continued even from behind bars because he'd always find someone to manipulate. Strange how Derek's prison transformation letter uses all the right therapy words but still feels exactly like his old tricks. I wonder if he picked up that language from mandatory counseling sessions just to try a new angle on getting what he wants. 1 month later, Veronica got a call from Derek's prison therapist requesting family history for his mandatory psychological evaluation. We spent 2 days putting together documentation of his lifetime pattern of manipulation, theft, and abuse. I included the forged checks, the mortgage fraud paperwork, screenshots of his threatening texts, and written statements about incidents going back to childhood. Veronica sent everything to the therapist with a cover letter detailing the restraining order violations and false police reports. The evaluation results came back 3 weeks later. The therapist diagnosed Derek with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits. The report recommended extended treatment and supervision upon release due to his high risk of reoffending. Reading those clinical terms felt like validation that his behavior wasn't just sibling rivalry, but serious psychological pathology. Around spring, I finally started dating again after avoiding it during all the chaos. On first dates, when people asked about family, I just said I had a brother I wasn't in contact with. The full story could wait until trust was built because nobody needed that drama dump over appetizers. I met someone nice through a hiking group and we started seeing each other regularly. As Derek's release date got closer, Veronica filed to extend the restraining order preemptively. She cited his continued attempts to contact me from prison and included the psychological evaluation showing his personality disorders. The judge granted the extension for another 5 years without even holding a hearing. Derek's release day finally arrived 8 months after his sentencing. He got transferred to a halfway house with strict supervision requirements, including no internet access and mandatory therapy. Within 3 hours of arriving, the halfway house called Veronica to report that Derek had been caught trying to use their office computer to create fake social media accounts. His supervision got extended immediately, and they banned him from all computers in the facility. 2 weeks later, the halfway house supervisor called Veronica to report that Derek had been telling other residents I was some millionaire who'd stolen his fortune and left him homeless. The other residents started questioning his story when the details kept changing. First, I was his evil sister who inherited everything. Then, I was his ex-wife who took him for millions. Then, I was his business partner who embezzled from their company. When they confronted him about the contradictions, he shoved one guy into a wall and had to be restrained by staff. They transferred him to a more restrictive facility that same day, one with higher security and less freedom. I was grabbing coffee downtown 3 weeks later when I literally bumped into Tom coming out of the same shop. He looked healthier than the last time I'd seen him at the courthouse, had gained some weight back and his eyes were clearer. We sat at a corner table and he told me Derek had tried calling him from the halfway house multiple times, but he never accepted the calls. I learned my lesson, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Some people don't want help, they want victims. We talked for maybe 10 minutes before going our separate ways, but it felt good knowing at least one person had broken free from Derek's manipulation. The 1-year anniversary of winning the lawsuit came and went without fanfare. I'd kept a house, built a real support system with actual friends who weren't just Derek's flying monkeys, and found something resembling peace. But I still checked the security cameras every morning and kept Veronica on retainer just in case. Some victories come with permanent vigilance, and I'd accepted that as the the price of freedom from Derek's chaos. Uncle Robert forwarded me an email 6 weeks later that Derek had somehow sent from the facility's counselor's computer during a therapy session. Derek was asking for family mediation to heal old wounds and move forward together. Robert hadn't responded, but wanted me aware in case Derek found other ways to reach out. The manipulation never stopped. It just changed forms like a virus adapting to new conditions. I documented everything, forwarded it to Veronica, and went back to pruning my tomato plants. 6 months passed quietly until I was out front gardening when my neighbor walked over and mentioned she'd seen someone matching Derek's description driving slowly past my house the previous evening. I pulled up the security footage, and there he was, clear as day, cruising by in some beat-up sedan and staring at my house. The restraining order was still active, and this was a clear violation. I downloaded the footage, filed another police report, and this time I wasn't scared or angry, just tired of the whole endless cycle. The cops picked him up 2 days later at a gas station near the supervised housing where he was supposed to be living. This time he didn't fight it, just pleaded guilty to avoid trial, and accepted another year of probation with GPS ankle monitoring. The judge warned him that any further violations would result in actual prison time, not just probation extensions. Derek was effectively trapped in a cycle of his own making, each violation extending his supervision, each extension giving him more opportunities to violate again. I started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter downtown, sharing my story of financial abuse and family manipulation during their support groups. So many survivors had their own Derek in their lives, someone who felt entitled to everything while contributing nothing, someone who turned family into weapons and love into leverage. It helped knowing I wasn't alone, and that maybe my experience could help others recognize the patterns before they lost everything. Another year passed peacefully with Derek monitored and unable to come near me or contact me. Through the family grapevine, I heard he was working minimum wage at a warehouse and living in supervised housing permanently now. For someone who'd felt entitled to everything I'd worked for, having to actually work for barely anything was probably the perfect justice. Sarah came by while I was repainting the front door, the same door Derek had kicked in during one of his tantrums years ago. "Remember when he broke this?" she asked, running her hand over the fresh paint. I did remember, but the memory didn't make my chest tight anymore. The house had been reclaimed inch by inch, transformed from a battlefield into an actual home through patience and persistence and a lot of fresh paint. Standing in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning 2.5 years after that first lawyer's letter, I realized the war was truly over. Derek was permanently restricted from my life by court order and GPS monitoring. The house was completely mine, and I'd built something he never could, which was genuine stability. His latest supervised housing report that Veronica had obtained showed he was still blaming others for his situation, still claiming victimhood, still refusing any accountability for his choices. But that was his burden now, not mine. I poured my coffee into Mom's favorite mug that I'd found in a box in the attic, looked out at the garden I'd planted where hers used to be, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, which was complete ownership of my life. The house wasn't just legally mine anymore. It was emotionally mine too, freed from the shadow of Derek's chaos and lies. Some battles don't end with dramatic confrontations or perfect revenge. They end with quiet survival and the simple act of outlasting the person trying to destroy you. I'd survived. I'd outlasted him, and now I could finally just live. Well, folks, that's been quite the ride, hasn't it? Appreciate you letting me crack wise while we watch this whole thing unfold. Like the video, it helps more than you think.